For more than 30 years, Margaret believed that silence was the price of peace, that if she didn't ask certain questions, didn't reopen old conversations, didn't challenge the version of events everyone else had accepted, life would remain stable enough to endure. And so she learned to smile at family gatherings, to redirect conversations when the past came too close, to tell herself that understanding everything wasn't necessary in order to move forward. But as time passed, that silence began to feel less like protection and more like a quiet weight she carried everywhere, especially in the moments when she was alone, replaying fragments of memories that never fully made sense. Until one evening, sitting across from her adult daughter during an ordinary conversation, she was asked a simple question that no one had ever dared to ask her before. A question spoken without accusation or drama, just genuine curiosity. And in that moment, something shifted inside her, because she realized she no longer felt tired at the thought of answering. She no longer felt afraid of what the truth might disturb, and for the first time she understood that silence had not preserved peace at all. It had only delayed clarity. And as she finally allowed herself to speak honestly, not to defend or justify, but simply to name what had been avoided for decades, she felt the strange calm that comes when a story is no longer hidden, when the past stops controlling the present. And she understood that it was never too late to tell the truth, even if the truth arrived quietly, long after everyone assumed it no longer mattered. After that conversation, Margaret expected to feel relief immediately, as if speaking the truth once would untangle decades of silence. But instead, what followed was something quieter and more complicated, because now that the words had been spoken, her mind began returning to moments she had trained herself to forget, small details that once seemed insignificant but now carried weight. The ways certain decisions were made without her voice, the way explanations were always postponed, the way she learned to accept answers that were incomplete because questioning them felt selfish at the time. And as she reflected on her younger self, she didn't feel anger so much as compassion, understanding how easily a person can confuse endurance with strength, especially when stability feels fragile and responsibility outweighs personal truth. And in those days that followed, she noticed subtle changes in herself, how she paused longer before responding, how she no longer rushed to smooth over uncomfortable moments, how silence no longer felt like an obligation but a choice. And she began to realize that the real impact of telling the truth wasn't in how others reacted, but in how it rearranged her own understanding of her life. Because for the first time, she was no longer protecting a version of the past that required her to disappear. And even though nothing dramatic happened on the surface, no confrontations or revelations that shocked the family, internally she felt something loosen, as if a door that had been closed for decades was now slightly open, letting in air she didn't realize she had been missing. And she understood that healing wasn't a single moment of courage, but a gradual willingness to stop pretending that silence had ever been neutral. In the weeks that followed, Margaret began to notice how deeply her old habits were woven into everyday moments. Because even after deciding to live more honestly, her instinct was still to anticipate other people's comfort before her own, to measure her words carefully so they would not disturb the fragile balance she had maintained for so long. And this awareness didn't arrive with drama, but with repetition, during ordinary mornings, familiar routines, and conversations that sounded the same yet felt different inside her. And she realized that much of her life had been shaped not by explicit demands, but by unspoken expectations. Expectations she had learned to fulfill automatically without questioning who they truly served. And as she started observing rather than immediately responding, she became aware of how often she had interpreted compromise as love and silence as maturity. And while part of her felt regret for the years spent minimizing herself, another part recognized that survival sometimes requires adaptation, especially when choices are limited and responsibility feels heavier than desire. And instead of condemning her past decisions, she allowed herself to understand them, seeing how each one had been made with the information and strength she had at the time. And this shift in perspective didn't erase the pain, but it softened it, transforming it from something sharp and unresolved into something she could finally hold without fear. And as days turned into weeks, she noticed that the more she honored her own clarity, the less she needed validation from others, because her sense of truth no longer depended on agreement. And for the first time, she felt that her life was not defined by what she endured, but by what she now chose to acknowledge. As Margaret slowly allowed herself to live with this new awareness, she began to notice subtle changes in how she moved through the world, because situations that once triggered immediate guilt or the urge to explain herself now created a pause instead. A quiet internal space where she could choose how to respond rather than react. And this pause felt unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable, as if she were breaking an unspoken rule she had followed her entire adult life. The rule that her role was to keep things smooth, manageable, and emotionally efficient for everyone around her. Yet, with time, she realized that this rule had cost her more than she ever admitted, because it had required constant emotional labor without recognition. And as she reflected on past moments, missed opportunities, restrained words, postponed desires, she understood that her silence had often been mistaken for agreement, both by others and by herself. And this realization brought a wave of quiet grief, not loud or dramatic, but steady and heavy, the grief of acknowledging how much of her inner life had remained unseen. And still, rather than allowing this grief to harden into bitterness, she chose to sit with it, to let it exist without rushing to justify or diminish it. And in doing so, she discovered that honesty did not demand confrontation or revenge, but presence, the courage to stay emotionally awake, even when it would be easier to retreat into old patterns. And with each small decision to remain present, to speak clearly, to say no without apology, to listen to her own discomfort, she felt herself reclaiming pieces of identity she had long assumed were gone, realizing they had simply been waiting for permission to return. What surprised Margaret most was not the resistance she occasionally encountered from others, but how unfamiliar it felt to fully trust her own perspective after so many years of doubting it. Because even when she spoke calmly and clearly, there was a lingering instinct to soften her words, to add explanations that made her truth easier for others to accept. And it took conscious effort to stop herself, to recognize that clarity did not require permission. And as she practiced this restraint, she began to see how deeply she had internalized the belief that her feelings needed to be justified in order to be valid, a belief reinforced by years of being told directly or indirectly that harmony mattered more than honesty. And during quiet evenings alone, she found herself revisiting moments she had once dismissed as insignificant, conversations where her discomfort had been politely ignored, decisions that were framed as practical but felt personal. And instead of pushing these memories away, she allowed them to exist without judgment, understanding that acknowledging them did not mean rewriting the past, only understanding it more accurately. And with this understanding came a sense of grounded strength, not loud or confrontational, but steady, the kind that does not demand attention, yet cannot be easily shaken. And she realized that growth at this stage of life was not about becoming someone new, but about finally standing fully inside the person she had always been, without shrinking or apologizing for her awareness. And as days passed, she felt less urgency to correct others' perceptions of her, because her sense of self no longer depended on being understood by everyone, only on being honest with herself. As Margaret continued living with this quieter but firmer sense of self, she began to recognize how deeply time had shaped her understanding of love, loyalty, and responsibility. Because for many years she believed that caring for others meant absorbing discomfort silently, that endurance was a sign of devotion, and that questioning long-standing arrangements risked unraveling everything she had worked so hard to maintain. Yet now she could see how these beliefs had formed not from choice, but from necessity, from a time when options felt limited and stability felt fragile. And this realization did not bring resentment so much as clarity, because it allowed her to separate who she had been required to be from who she truly was beneath those roles. And as she navigated conversations with this new awareness, she noticed how often people expected her to remain predictable, agreeable, and emotionally available in the ways she always had been. And while part of her still felt the familiar pull to comply, another part recognized that consistency should not come at the cost of self-erasure. And in moments when she gently but firmly held her ground, she felt the subtle discomfort of others adjusting to a version of her that no longer smoothed every edge. And instead of interpreting that discomfort as failure, she accepted it as evidence of growth, understanding that change often feels unsettling, not because it is wrong, but because it challenges patterns people rely on. And through this process, she learned that setting boundaries was not an act of withdrawal, but an act of honesty, a way of showing up fully rather than partially. And although this shift did not rewrite her past, it transformed her present, allowing her to move forward with a sense of dignity that no longer depended on sacrifice alone. With time, Margaret began to understand that the most difficult part of change was not speaking differently or setting boundaries, but allowing herself to exist without constantly monitoring how she was being perceived, because for decades her sense of safety had been tied to approval, to being seen as reasonable, dependable, and emotionally controlled. And stepping outside of that identity felt at first like standing without armor, exposed to judgment she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Yet, as days passed, she noticed something unexpected, that most reactions, whether confused, distant, or quietly accepting, passed more quickly than she imagined, while the relief of staying true to herself lingered. And this contrast taught her an important lesson, that the fear of discomfort had always been heavier than the discomfort itself. And as she reflected on this, she realized how many decisions in her past had been shaped by anticipated reactions rather than genuine desire, how often she had chosen predictability over honesty simply because it felt safer. And instead of blaming herself for those choices, she allowed compassion to replace criticism, recognizing that survival often disguises itself as compliance, especially for those taught early that harmony must be protected at all costs. And now, standing in this later chapter of her life, she felt no urgency to prove anything, no need to explain why her voice sounded steadier or why her silence felt intentional rather than forced. Because for the first time, her internal world felt aligned, and even when uncertainty appeared, it no longer threatened her sense of self, but simply reminded her that growth was not a destination she reached, but a way of living that required presence, patience, and the courage to remain awake to her own truth. One afternoon, while revisiting old photographs and letters she had kept tucked away for years, Margaret noticed how differently she now interpreted moments she once remembered only through the lens of responsibility and restraint. Because what stood out were not the events themselves, but the expressions she had worn, the careful smiles, the composed posture, the absence of space for uncertainty or vulnerability. And this observation stirred a quiet sadness that surprised her, not because the memories were painful, but because they revealed how consistently she had placed herself last in order to maintain a sense of order. And as she sat with these images, she realized that she had spent much of her life preparing for later, postponing honesty, rest, and personal fulfillment as if there would always be a more appropriate time to claim them. And now, aware of how swiftly years pass, she understood that waiting had never guaranteed safety, only delay. And this awareness did not push her toward drastic change, but toward intentional living, toward choosing presence over postponement. And in small but meaningful ways, she began allowing herself moments that required no explanation, quiet mornings, unstructured afternoons,
decisions made simply because they felt right rather than necessary. And through these choices, she discovered that peace was not something earned through sacrifice alone, but something cultivated through attention, through honoring what felt true in the present moment. And although she knew that not every question from the past needed to be answered, she also understood that her future no longer needed to be shaped by silence, because clarity, once embraced, gently continued to guide her forward.
In the end, Margaret understood that her life had not been defined by what she endured, but by the moment she stopped believing that endurance was the same as fulfillment, because clarity did not arrive as a dramatic confrontation or a final explanation, but as a quiet acceptance of her own experience. And this acceptance changed the way she carried herself, the way she listened, the way she allowed space for both connection and distance without guilt. And as she looked toward the years ahead, she no longer felt pressure to reclaim lost time or to rewrite her past into something more comfortable for others to understand, because she knew that meaning was not created by correcting old stories, but by living honestly within the one still unfolding. And while some questions would remain unanswered, they no longer felt threatening because her sense of peace was no longer tied to resolution, but to self-trust. And with this trust came a freedom she had never known before, the freedom to choose presence over explanation, truth over convenience, and quiet authenticity over approval. And as she stepped forward into this new chapter, she did so without urgency or fear, aware that healing did not require perfection or closure, only the courage to remain awake to herself. And in that awareness, she found something she had waited a lifetime to feel. Not certainty, but calm, a steady and enduring peace that finally felt like home.